Please turn in your Bibles to the book of Genesis chapter 32, verse 22. I do recommend you turn there this morning, as I'm going to be keeping the same graphic up on the board. I did not have the opportunity today to be able to make text slides for you, so you are going to have to follow along with me in Genesis 32 and maybe jot down the notes for other passages that I reference here, although there's not very many of them. But we're going to be talking about the subject of conversion this morning, and by conversion, we basically mean the process of embracing and accepting the Christian faith, or if we were to put it more simply, we could call it the process, of getting saved. Converting is getting saved, and there's a lot of speculation around this subject. Am I saved? And if so, how do I know that I'm saved? What are the signs that I'm saved? When was my moment of conversion? And how do I know that moment was significant enough? What if I can't point to this dramatic crisis in my life when it happened? The guy next to me says his life he was living in the muck and the mire, and he fell to his knees and he said, "Jesus, please save me." And I didn't have anything like that at all. I did everything right, and I baked the principal brownies for at school, and I never did anything wrong. I didn't have a dramatic experience like that. Does that mean that I'm not converted? Does that mean that I'm not actually saved? And can I lose my salvation after I've already gained it? And if yes, how do I lose it? There's just questions about it. And questions like these consume a lot of the Christian community's thinking. Whole church practices around baptism and membership and leadership get built on differing opinions on them. And with this in mind, my goal today is to shed some light on this by looking at a real conversion experience in the life of a very important Old Testament figure. We're going way, way back here and looking at conversion early on in the history of the Christian faith. And that account we're going to look at is in the life of Jacob. Now, before we read this account, I want to understand why this encounter with God that he has matters so much. We need to understand how Jacob got here. Years earlier, Jacob deceived his father Isaac and stole the blessing that rightfully belonged to Esau, his brother. And he did so by dressing up as Esau, lying to a blind old man's face, walking away with everything Esau should have inherited. And Esau's response was a vow to take his life. So Jacob ran. And he spent the next 20 years with his uncle Laban. That relationship wasn't great either. It turned out to be its own kind of wrestling match. Laban deceived Jacob out of wages and wives, and Jacob deceived Laban right back through his own shrewd breeding schemes. And so it was basically two con men locked in a 2-decade standoff. Eventually, Jacob decided it was time to go home, but going home meant that he needed to face Esau again. And last time he saw Esau said he was going to kill him. Esau, again, is the brother that he betrayed. And Esau, he had heard, was coming to meet him with 400 men. And Jacob really didn't have any idea at this point if this 400-man army was a welcoming party or an army that was intending to kill him and destroy him. So he sent gifts ahead and divided his camp in fear and prayed the most desperate prayer of his entire life. And then alone in the dark on the very night before he had to face the consequences of who he had always been, a man showed up and started wrestling with him. And this was the greatest moment of crisis Jacob had ever faced in his entire life. He was in the middle of that crucible, and as he was in this crucible, he had an encounter with God that was genuinely transformative. It's not a stretch to call this Jacob's quote-unquote moment of conversion. He went into the encounter as Jacob, the heel catcher, the deceiver. He came out as Israel, the one who overcomes. And so we're going to read this account together, and then we're going to unpack it, okay? So follow along with me as I read, beginning in verse 22, where it says, "That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all of his possessions. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched, as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, 'Let me go, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob replied, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.' The man asked, 'What is your name?' 'Jacob,' he answered. Then the man said, 'Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome.' Jacob said, 'Please tell me your name.' But he replied, 'Why do you ask my name?' Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. Now, this account shows us the steps in the process of Jacob's conversion. And they're up on the screen in front of you right now, and they're going to stay there the whole time. All right, resist, cling, triumph. Resist, cling, and triumph. We're going to look at each of these now, and along the way, we're going to lay them alongside the experience of Paul the Apostle, a New Testament saint whose conversion followed a strikingly similar pattern. Resist, cling, and triumph. Here we go. First, Jacob resisted God in his own strength, and we see that in verse 24. Follow along with me as I read again. So Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man attacked him in the dark, Jacob did exactly what he had always done before. He fought back with everything he had, his strength, his cunning, his sheer determination to not lose. This was the same toolkit that had gotten him the birthright. It was the same toolkit that had caused him to outlast Laban for 20 years. He used deception when deception was called for. He used grit when grit was called for. Jacob had never met an obstacle that he couldn't outwork or outmaneuver. And he brought every bit of this into this fight, assuming that, like always, if he just held on and worked hard enough, he would come out ahead in this match as well. And with this in mind, there's something I want you to see that we can easily miss, and that is that Jacob wasn't trying to fight God here. He wasn't intentionally resisting God here. He didn't know this was God. He was simply doing what he'd always done. He was solving the problem in front of him with his own strength and on his own terms, giving no thought whatsoever to the possibility that God might be the one he actually needed. And that's exactly how self-sufficiently works in all of our lives. We rarely set out to resist God. We just handle our lives, we handle our finances, our relationships, our decisions, whatever, without bringing God into the room. We call it independence, we call it being responsible, but functionally, it was the same thing Jacob was doing in the dark. He was fighting against God without ever intending to, simply by leaving him out of the equation. And we see this same pattern in the life of Saul of Tarsus before he became Paul the Apostle. In his zeal for God, Saul was, without realizing it, waging war against Christ himself and against Christ's church. And remember that he wasn't a rebel by his own estimation. He was devout. He was committed. Certainly, he was serving God faithfully. At least that's what he was thinking. And then on the road to Damascus, Christ revealed himself to him, and he revealed exactly what he had been doing all along. And it says in verse 9, or it says in the book of Acts chapter 9 this, and I quote, "He fell to the ground," that's Saul. Saul fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" "Who are you, Lord?" Saul asked. "I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting." And the idea here is that Saul thought he was serving God, but Christ told him that he was actually persecuting God the entire time. And that gap between what we think we're doing and what we're actually doing is exactly where Jacob stood on the night that we're looking at when he was in the Jabbok, wrestling with God. And it's where a lot of us are standing today, and we don't even realize it. And here's what's remarkable about all of this. This whole season of self-sufficiency, of active, if not unintentional resistance, it was really never wasted. It was actually part of Jacob's conversion path. God was present in all of it. He was at work underneath Jacob's scheming long before Jacob ever knew it. And we see this clearly with Jacob. Even in his years of scheming and self-reliance, God continually blessed him with flocks and with herds and with children and with prosperity. We see it with Paul as well, as he rose through the ranks of the Pharisees. He was zealous, he was accomplished, and he was really prominent among the religious ranks before Damascus. If we're paying attention, we can see that God was always with Jacob in ways that he was never with Laban, and that he was never with Esau. Do you follow me? As you read through there and you're paying attention, you can see that God was always with Jacob in a very different, in a very distinct way. It wasn't the way it was with Laban. It wasn't the way that it was with Esau. Why was it different? It's because the seeds of faith were always present in Jacob. Jacob may have pursued Isaac's birthright through cunning and deception, but the fact that he pursued it at all revealed something underneath the deception. It revealed that Jacob actually valued it. Esau, by contrast, sold his birthright for a bowl of stew. Did you know that? If you go back and read in the book of Genesis, there was a point where Esau came in from hunting, and he was famished, and Jacob was making this big bowl of stew. And he says, "Give me some food, I'm starving." And Jacob said, "Sell me your birthright." He says, "Yeah, sure," for a bowl of stew. Jacob's methods were wrong, but his hunger for what God had promised was in its own crooked way a form of faith. Do you follow me? It was there. It was jacked up, but it was there. What does this mean? It means that when we are self-sufficient, we resist God without even realizing it. But it also means that God is still present with us in that period, patiently at work, even while we're fighting him. It means that resistance isn't necessarily disqualifying. In fact, it can actually be an indicator of faith. Years later, when Paul retold the story of his Damascus road encounter to King Agrippa, he quoted what Christ had said to him that day, and he quoted it in this way. This is Acts chapter 26, verse 14. "We all fell to the ground, and I heard a voice say to me in Aramaic, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads.'" What is a goad? A goad is a sharp stick used to prod an ox in the direction that it needed to go. And an ox that kicks against it doesn't escape, it only injures itself. Christ's choice of words tells us something important. It tells us that Saul's rage against the church wasn't pure defiance. Underneath it, he was already being prodded, already fighting something in himself. And his resistance was, at least in part, a symptom of conviction, a sign that faith was already present in him and already colliding with the direction that his life was heading. Does that make sense? With this in mind, the most hostile, the most resistant, the most quote-unquote unsavable person in your life might actually be in the process of being converted right now. Follow me? That person who could never be saved. That person who is so hostile to God and his kingdom. They might actually be under conviction. God might be converting them right now. Consider this for a moment. There was no one in the time of the early church, there was no one who was more lost. There was no one who was more unsavable than Saul of Tarsus. Even 3 years after his conversion, when he tried to join the believers in Jerusalem, they were still afraid of him, and they still didn't believe that his conversion was real. With this in mind, who is that hopelessly lost person in your life today? Pray for them. They may be further along in the process of conversion than you think. God may have plans for their life that neither you nor they can see. And so that's resistance, okay? But let's move on, because the next thing we see is that Jacob clung to God in his brokenness. First he resisted, then he clung. All right, we see that in verses 25 through 26 when it says, "When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched, and as he wrestled, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, 'Let me go, for it is daybreak.' But Jacob replied, 'I will not let you go unless you bless me.'" Up until this moment, Jacob had no idea who he was fighting. In the dark, with everything on the line, he probably assumed this was just one more obstacle standing between him and survival. But in the instant that the man touched his hip, the instant his own strength was taken off the table, everything changed. Jacob realized that it wasn't an ordinary opponent who could be outlasted or outmaneuvered. Only God could disable him with a single touch. And in that sense, the wound that he received was the revelation. Jacob didn't get a voice from heaven announcing who this was. He got a wrecked hip instead. And in that pain, he finally understood exactly who he had been wrestling with all along. And that awareness changed everything about how Jacob fought. But notice, it didn't make him stop fighting. The same seeds of faith that had always been buried underneath his deception and cunning now had something to attach to. All of that relentless, refuse to quit energy that used to be aimed at outlasting Esau and outmaneuvering Laban got redirected in an instant. And Jacob didn't release his grip and walk away defeated in an instant. Instead, he tightened it and he clung. And with this in mind, what I want you to see here is that conversion isn't necessarily a transformation of who we are. It's a redirection of our energy from resisting God in self-sufficiency to clinging to him in our brokenness. Again, it's a redirection of our energy from resisting God in self-sufficiency to clinging to him in brokenness. And this is where we need to correct a common misconception about conversion. A lot of people picture it as a complete personality overhaul, as though becoming a Christian means becoming a fundamentally different person with different gifts, different drives, and different temperaments altogether. A lot of times people conceptualize spiritual gifts as something that was completely absent before and is present only after you're saved, all right? But it doesn't quite work that way. Now, Paul's language in 2 Corinthians 5:17 lends itself to this thinking sometimes. And I'm quoting to you now where it says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come. The old is gone, the new is here." Paul calls believers new creations, and it's easy to hear that as a promise of total replacement, like the old you is gone and a different person entirely has taken its place. But that's not what happened to Jacob, and that's not how conversion actually works. Conversion takes everything God has already placed in you, your talents, your intensity, your particular way of moving through the world, and it redirects it. What you used to invest in your own self-interest and survival, you now invest in God's kingdom. In other words, conversion doesn't erase you, it points you in the right direction for the first time in your life. And Paul's conversion followed the same pattern, just so you know. On his way to Damascus to arrest and persecute the church there, he was struck blind by the same light that revealed Christ to him. And in that moment, he realized that he had been fighting against God himself, something that he had never recognized before. But notice what didn't happen next in this account. His personality didn't change. His intensity didn't get dialed down. Instead, he took all that same energy and redirected it into building the church across the known world. It could well be argued, I think it can be faithfully argued, that no one alive at that time had the sheer tenacity of Paul. There was no one like him at that time, and that's why he was right for the job. That's why he was chosen for the job that he had. This is a guy who could walk into a city, preach the gospel, be received with hostility by a mob, stoned, dragged out of the city, and left for dead, and then he gets back up. And he walks back into the city again. Happened in Lystra. Check it out in Acts chapter 14. The idea here is that his conversion didn't change his personality or his talents. It redirected them from self-interest to serving God. That same intensity that he used to persecute the church before, he used to build the church after. What does this mean? It means the drive, the gifts, the relentless energy that you already have are not obstacles to your faith. They are raw material for your faith. Conversion doesn't ask you to become someone else. It asks you to aim everything that you are in a new direction, towards clinging to God instead of resisting him. Now, it's often said that our greatest strengths are also our greatest weaknesses, but the reverse is also true, and that is that our greatest weaknesses can become tremendous sources of strength once they're redirected towards the kingdom of God. For example, I've probably shared this account with you before, this story of my own life, but I have always had a tendency to dig in and attempt to prove people wrong when they tell me that I can't do something. When they say you can't, it makes me dig in and say, oh yeah? Let me show you. One costly example of this in my own life was the first time that I pursued college when I went to Penn State, back when I first got out of the Army. My prospects, were not promising initially. I had dropped out of high school and got a GED just to join the Army. I was way behind, and so I was told up front that my chances were very slim of getting accepted, mostly because I would struggle with the math portion. But when I heard this, your prospects aren't good, you're not going to be able to do it, you're not going to be able to keep up with the math. When I heard that, something was triggered within me, and I studied hard, and I prepared, and I took the placement test, and I scored higher than anyone would have expected. By this time, Holly was in my life, and she was tutoring me as well. And afterwards, the school's response changed immediately. They said, well, we were wrong about you, Mr. Piazza. You're going to do just fine. You're accepted. What's your major going to be? You know what I said? Math. I said, math. Math is going to be my major. And I declared a math major purely out of spite. I did this just to rub it in their face and to prove them wrong and to keep proving them wrong. I'd already proved them wrong, but I wanted to keep proving, just keep rubbing it in their face. And so I spent 2.5 years pursuing a degree that I never really wanted, wasting money, wasting time. And that's how a part of my personality operated in its fallen and unredeemed state. But when that same instinct was surrendered to God and aimed at his kingdom instead, it became something else entirely. It was weakness, but now I can stand here. And can I say this without sounding harsh? I can stand here in an arguably failing church that others are writing off. Sometimes it's hopeless. And I can say, yeah, we'll see about that. And I can stick with it along with you guys until God proves everyone wrong. And when God proves everyone wrong, he's going to do it in a way that brings him glory and advances his interests. You follow me? That's what happens when the bad part of you gets redeemed. That same energy that hurt you before becomes powerful. So that's clinging. So now we're going to talk about triumph, okay? Jacob triumphed in the end with God in his weakness. We see that in verses 27 through 29. The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. The man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. Jacob's conversion stuck. Have you ever seen conversions that didn't seem to stick? Jacob stuck. He triumphed with God, not just that night, but for the rest of his life, because he remained dependent upon God from that point forward. A huge part of that ongoing dependence can be traced back to the wound in his hip, an injury that stayed with him permanently. God removed his ability to be strong in himself. And this wound, which looked to the world like nothing but a curse, was actually a blessing from God because it kept Jacob from forgetting. It kept him from reverting back to the person that he used to be. With this in mind, what happened at the Jabbok wasn't just a single dramatic night that Jacob looked back and kind of called his moment of conversion, if you will. It became the defining posture of the rest of his life. From this point forward, Jacob's faith wasn't a memory of one encounter when he went forward to an altar and prayed the prayer or something of that nature. It was an ongoing thing. It was a daily dependence upon God that never let up. In other words, Jacob didn't triumph once and then coast on the momentum. He triumphed continually precisely because he never again had the option of relying fully upon himself. Yes, this encounter at the Jabbok was a huge moment in his life, but it was a moment of change that was sustained for the remainder of his life. He didn't go back. He didn't revert back to the person that he used to be ever again. The limp is what made that ongoing dependence unavoidable. Every single step that Jacob took for the rest of his life reminded him physically that his own strength had failed him once and it could fail him again. He couldn't forget the Jabbok, even if he wanted to, because his body wouldn't let him. And so what looked like a permanent injury to the rest of the world was actually a permanent safeguard, a built-in reminder that kept him from ever quietly drifting back into the old self-reliant man that he used to be. It was a blessing. It hurt him. He felt it every day of his life, but it was a blessing none the same. Paul had a strikingly similar experience. We know how he carried a physical affliction that God begged him to remove. And we'll read the text in a second, but it's possible, based upon other New Testament passages, particularly in Galatians, that this affliction was related to his eyes. And it's possible that it was some kind of a lasting residual effect of the blindness that he was struck with on the Damascus road. We don't know that for sure, but there's a lot of evidence there for that. Whatever it was, God chose to leave it on Paul to keep him humble and dependent for the rest of his life. And he recounts this in 2 Corinthians 12, and I quote, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest upon me." What does this mean? It means that our scars and our brokenness are not evidence that something went wrong. They are part of the blessing. from God. They exist to keep us clinging, to keep us from ever again trusting fully in our own strength. The very thing, in many cases, that we would love for God to remove, the very thing that we plead God to remove from our life, might be the thing that's keeping us with Him, keeping us close, like with Paul. Now, without going into detail, I've shared this as well, but this fits here. Without going into detail, 18 years ago now, on Easter Sunday, I made the biggest ministry mistake of my entire life. I was provoked into it by a very, very mean person, but in an extreme act of carelessness and pride, full of just dumb immaturity, I took the action of calling someone out publicly in the middle of an Easter Sunday service. The service was packed. I don't think that the church had ever been more full of visitors and just people all over. I mean, it was just absolutely packed. And in the middle of that service, I called this person out in front of everybody. I'm embarrassed to admit it now. I mean, I can't believe I did that, but I did it. And this foolish action nearly ended my ministry in its infancy. I mean, I was only a year into ministry at that time. Before that mistake, I was arrogant and overconfident, but in the aftermath, I was broken. I did recover, and I continued on in ministry, obviously, but I was never the same. The scars never left me. I never forgot how wrong I was capable of being, and that awareness never left me going forward. It had a positive effect upon me. It made me teachable in a way that I hadn't been before. It enabled me to receive instruction and correction that I would never have been able to take in otherwise. It set the stage for me to be able to go to Toccoa and to learn. The scar of that wound remains to this day, but it still serves me to this day. I cannot emphasize to you enough how different I am after that. Before, I was way more charismatic and boisterous than I am now. And what I mean to say, I was almost obnoxious, but I was the guy that would walk into a room and intentionally draw attention to myself. I was good at it too. I would participate in joint services, and I would tell jokes from the platform, and I would do it on the fly. I would get everyone laughing. I was that guy that was always boldly saying things, boldly doing things, just getting a laugh out of everybody all the time. And after that blunder, it just took all that away. Like, I'm just not the same. I'm cautious now with the way that I speak. I'm using the wrong word, but I really never got my mojo back, but in a good way. It's good that I didn't. I don't talk like that anymore. I don't go around trying to draw attention to myself anymore or working the room that way. I used to be able to do it, but now I don't. And it's good, it's better. And all of that is a result of that wound, that scar that continues with me to this day. I'm closer to God for it, I'm wiser for it, I'm quieter for it, I'm more inhibited for it. But it's still there. I'm not lying when I say that it's almost been 2 decades now, but every now and again, it flashes into my head and I'm like, I can't believe I did that. What was I thinking? You know what I mean? It's still to this day, it hits me that way. Not like in a crushing way, but it just never has gone away. But in closing, Jacob resisted God, not out of open rebellion, but out of sheer self-sufficiency, doing life the same way he had always done, giving God little to no thought in the process. And that's resistance, by the way. Paul did the same thing in his own zealous, devout way, entirely convinced that he was serving God while he was actually working against him. He was so convinced that it took a voice from heaven to reveal the truth to him. His resistance didn't mean that he was lost, though. It was actually a function of the genuine faith that was already present in his heart, and it was manifesting in his life as conviction. So the reason I share this is that if there's a person in your life who seems hopelessly resistant to God, don't write them off. Pray for them. They may actually be further along in the conviction process than you realize. Then in brokenness, Jacob's hip was wrenched out of joint. Also, Paul was struck blind on the Damascus road. Both men, as a result, shifted their energy not into passivity, but into clinging. With the same intensity, with the same drive, they were redirected from resisting God to holding on to him for dear life. And that's the heart of conversion. Not becoming a different person, but becoming a person who finally points everything that they are towards God instead of away from him. You're still the same person, but it's channeled the right direction now. So whatever you've built your life on so far, your talents, your stubbornness, your drive to prove people wrong, whatever it is, none of it has to be discarded. It just needs to be redirected. It's not that there's something wrong with you. God made you the way you are for a reason. It just needs to be redeemed and pointed towards God. And finally, both men triumphed long term, not just in the moment. Jacob walked the rest of his life with a limp. Paul carried a thorn in the flesh that he was never allowed to shed. Neither wound was removed, but neither man reverted back to who they used to be either. The very thing that looked like a curse to the outside world was actually what kept them clinging to God for the rest of their lives. And here's what's worth noticing through all of this. God was present at every single phase. He was with Jacob and with Paul before either of them was consciously with him, blessing them, preserving them even when they resisted him. He was the one who initiated their brokenness as well, meeting them in the crisis and breaking their self-sufficiency so that clinging became possible. And he was the one who left the scars in place afterwards, not to punish them, but to keep them near him, for good. And so if you're asking yourself this morning if your conversion is legit, if I'm actually saved, if I fit the pattern, whether it was dramatic enough or whatever, is there a moment where I went and prayed the prayer and that kind of thing? You know, I would encourage you this morning to look at Jacob and look at Paul as well and realize that conversion isn't a moment that you have to perform correctly. It is a process that involves resisting, clinging, and then triumph. And God is present through every step of it. Before you ever knew he was there, too long after the wound that keeps you close to him is healed on the outside, but never quite on the inside. And so, in closing, there is no one-size-fits-all for conversion. Don't waste your energy trying to fit some pattern. Just be open to what God is doing in your life now and let him convert you. Also, be looking around for people on the journey that you can point towards that direction as well. With that said, would you pray with me?